Hey everyone, in this lecture we're going to spend a few minutes talking about how social workers can have an impact on policy. Also spend a few minutes talking about power. Now, believe it or not, social workers actually can have an impact on policy if they act or if they work at the micro level and if they work at the macro level. My sense is that at the macro level, a practitioner's ability to influence policy is much more it's much more overt and concrete. But believe it or not, even people who are doing very micro kinds of practice are also influencing policy as well. And we're going to talk about how that's done over the course of this lecture here. So one of the ways that social workers working really in micro levels have an impact on policy is to provide feedback to the regulatory or the legislative bodies, sort of those stakeholders who are responsible for whatever program a social worker works for. So by nature or by virtue of the work that we do, which is often funded through public channels, we have a link. Even if it's only a very small link, but we have a link to people who are sort of responsible for administering those public dollars. And it's through those channels that we really can influence policy, even if if our work really is sort of overtly at the micro level. Just advance the slide here. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about sort of power and how social workers wield their power sort of effectively. So oftentimes social workers are very sensitive to power, and part of that's because part of our job is to empower people who have been disempowered. But really, by virtue of our positions, by virtue of our training, we have more power than maybe we think we have, or maybe that we're comfortable with. And so it's really important that we sort of think thoughtfully about how we wield that power and how we use it to advance the goals of the profession and the agency that we work for and the needs of clients, that kind of thing. So power oftentimes, the way it's wielded effectively is to sort of view it as the ability to subtly influence, not to force. So the kind of power that's wielded by force often is sort of despotic or harmful in some ways, right? It's monarchical. But really, the ways that social workers tend to wield power is much more of a person-to-person kind of power, and it's much more about influence as opposed to overt social control. And in that way, that when person-to-person influence sort of accumulates, that's sort of what I mean by kind of indirect decision-making here, or indirect influence in the bullet point here on this slide. That second sort of indirect form of power comes really in the form of decision-making when the sort of traditional channels of making decisions are bypassed or subverted, and that's detailed in some of the information here on that slide. Successful power users, and by in some ways I mean sort of responsible power users, are persistent. They're flexible, but they're also sort of personally credible, and that's sort of what I mean also in this previous slide here by tenor, tempo, and scope of conflict. And that is really to say that people who thoughtfully and judiciously exercise power do so at a pace that's comfortable for others, right? But they are persistent in the pursuit of their goals. They are flexible by the means that they get there. But the tone of the way that they get there, that's what's meant by tenor. The tone of the way that they use power is sort of accessible by others. And they have some degree of personal credibility here, which we'll which we'll talk about next. So one of the ways to really develop power and sort of cultivate power, which is a part of that process of sort of using it thoughtfully, is developing this idea of personal credibility as well. And so to be personally credible, typically people are reasonable. They're pragmatic, which is sort of another way of saying practical. So there's a sense that the goal is achievable. They have the appearance of being a team player. They have integrity. They're authoritative without being sort of disingenuous or unkind. They have sort of a track record of success, and they align themselves with institutions that sort of share those kinds of goals. People who are credible oftentimes work in networks, and that's sort of also what I mean by sort of aligning yourself with an institution that sort of shares your goals. The network sort of vouches for a person for their in their quest for personal credibility. The network also sort of provides, mentorship and soundboards, access to a diverse array of opinions and that kind of thing. The big idea of a network too is that it creates links for a person with power to sort of help, right? So that information is sort of diffused or disseminated throughout that sort of personal network, and that sort of helps to give people power. Now, for social workers, oftentimes our network is our colleagues, our coworkers, people we went to graduate school with, people who are working in similar kinds of organizations, or similarly aligned organizations as the ones that we're doing. So we often have sort of a built-in network. We joined a network by virtue of sort of joining an organization as an employee. And oftentimes that we're joining an institution, no matter how small or large, but it's an institution that sort of shares our vision of the world. So it's a pretty easy way to affiliate ourselves with a group of people who sort of become that preformed network. But this is one of the ways that social workers sort of have power and influence, is by sort of banding together in professional organizations and in institutions, and sort of continuing their mission as well. Just advance the slide here. A big part of what social workers do with their power is to really sort of shape contexts. So the context might be, it might refer to something like the context in which services are delivered. That's oftentimes what it means. It might mean the context in which people live. But that's a big way that we can sort of exert power, is to sort of shape context so that it's more conducive to successful service transaction or healthy living, that kind of thing. I mentioned in this slide here, I mentioned lobbyists, since they are also often getting the ear of policymakers. And there are lobbyists who sort of work in the social work realm as well. Some of them work for CSWE and NASW, but more often they work for insurance companies and healthcare organizations as well. I mention lobbyists because it's important to sort of know the messages that they're giving to our policymakers as well, and make sure our messages are sort of consistent. Lobbyists are part of that sort of broader group of stakeholders that it's important to maintain contact with. When stakeholders sort of sound the alarm, which is sort of what I'm talking about in this fourth bullet point on the slide here, when they sort of cry foul or sound the alarm on something that's happening, it oftentimes can be pretty difficult to manage. So let's just conclude this lecture by just talking about some of the ways that people really engaged in micro-level practice can have an impact on service. So the first is this idea of street-level bureaucrats. And That comes from the Hayes and Mickelson reading. But what they really mean by street-level bureaucrats is that is the social workers who are responsible for administering social policy enacted by governments. And so oftentimes social workers are employed by private organizations, but they're distributing benefits that are paid for with public dollars. So there's this weird transition of those dollars from the public arena into the private arena. And that's part of the way that social policy, that's part of the mechanism that social policy has to improve people's lives, despite the fact that there is that sort of crossing of private dollars into the public sphere. And oftentimes social workers are often acting on behalf of other agencies or on behalf of the government, and that's certainly what happens when arrests or confinements or mental health commitments are made. It's certainly what happens when children are placed. You've got sort of a social worker employed by a private agency acting on behalf of a public entity. Some people criticize the role of social workers in these ways by saying that we're agents of social control. So it's important to be sort of aware of that. And social control really is sort of the harmful exercise of power. But again, the idea, the theme of this sort of short lecture has been really to ask the question, how do we wield power so that it advances the goals of the profession and advances things like justice? And so what we have to do is when we, or what we have to sort of think about is when we do things that could sort of be conceptualized as social control, are we doing those things thoughtfully and after a sort of a reasoned decision-making process? Lastly, second to last thing, social workers have an awful lot of discretion in the kind of work that we do, and we're often asked to enforce rules that are enormously complex or sort of apply rules to enormously complex situations. So the amount of discretion we have is another way that we can sort of exercise power as well. Discretion is often thought of as not making an action or not executing an action when one is indicated, and so it's sort of wielding the option to not exercise power if that makes sense. Nevertheless, I think sort of careful consideration of discretion is one of the ways that social workers exercise their power, sort of in service of the greater good, and in service of sort of the bigger values of our profession. So this slide is sort of a recap of those ideas, but it really, in the terms that Hayes and Mickelson use, direct service workers are sort of those street-level bureaucrats, right? So they're the ones that are actually interfacing with people, and they're enforcing policy by virtue of interpreting and implementing policy to their clients. The Lipsky article, which we didn't read this particular year, but one of the things that Lipsky argues is that the exercise of discretion by social workers is sort of at the same level as people in similar professions, teachers, police officers, other emergency personnel, that kind of thing. And in some ways, what I think Lipsky is saying is that discretion is a pretty important tool, but it's also a pretty powerful tool that we have available to us. The last bullet point here is sort of my attempt to kind of integrate Lipsky's sentiments with what this whole idea of the street level bureaucrat things are, and really the salient issue here is that there's a difference in information available to sort of the street level worker and workers at the highest level, and sort of often the best case scenario is what's used form policy at the highest level. And in practice, in sort of day-to-day situations, situations are rarely sort of aligned with what the best case scenario was. So that sort of mismatch of information is problematic. But that nevertheless sort of speaks to the importance of social workers sort of interacting with policymakers and legislators and stakeholders to provide feedback on policy and sort of how things are working. And so what I'm concluding this particular presentation with is just a list of a couple of formal ways to sort of influence policy. And that can be done through documentation, through providing testimony or expert witness. It can be done through other forms of written communication. And then perhaps one of the most important ways we can interact with policymakers is by encouraging our clients to interact with policymakers, whether we do that as an advocate or a consultant, or simply by helping people register to vote. That's sort of what brings it all together. So oftentimes interacting with a legislator or stakeholder doesn't even need to be face-to-face. I mean, the nice thing now with the advent of sort of the internet and electronic forms of communication is that you can send legislators emails. You can send them information. You can fill out forms online that sort of communicates a particular perspective to them. And you can certainly do that as a social worker, and you can certainly do that as sort of a private citizen. Sort of the important, the lesson from this lecture is sort of that it's sort of done in both domains. At any rate, thanks for watching. Any questions, feel free to get in touch. Thanks.